So thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the fifth annual collaboration between Albany Public Library and the Adirondack Experience, and this year's True Crime of the Adirondack Zoom series. I'm Megan Kelly, Programs and Partnerships Librarian at Albany Public Library. I'd like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that Albany Public Library is situated on the land of the Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans. The Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in our two regions and practice their teachings and life ways. Tonight, we look forward to taking you down a path of intrigue, suspense, thrilling exploits, and villainous characters. A truly dark tale from the Adirondacks past. We are joined by author Michael Benson. Benson's gripping tale, Escape from Dannemora, recounts the escape by the two worst of the worst murderers from the Clinton Correctional Institute on June 6, 2015, and the subsequent manhunt, the largest in New York State history. The escapees, David Sweat and Richard Matt, coursed a 20-minute claustrophobic labyrinth of corridors and tunnels until they emerged into freedom on the outside. Now they were killers on the loose, deadly and desperate. The story that unfolded was one of adventure, psychology, sex, depravity, and brutality. Benson is the author and co-author of multiple other books, including books about mobsters and the mafia. His Why the Grateful Dead Matter remains a Bible of hippiedom. Benson was born in Rochester and raised in Chile, New York. He currently lives in Brooklyn. Throughout the evening, please feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank
And
you.
thanks everybody for listening tonight. We get started. It was the Great Escape, June 6th, 2015. The escapees coursed a 20-minute claustrophobic labyrinth of corridors and tunnels until they emerged into freedom on the outside. And now they were killers on the loose, deadly and desperate. The story that unfolded was one of adventure, psychology, sex, depravity, and brutality. The escape of David Sweat and Richard Matt from the Clinton prison in Dannemora was the biggest story of 2015. It had it all. And my book, Escape from Dannemora, told the whole story for the first time. I had the pleasure of researching it pretty much in real time. Dannemora is surrounded by wilderness in the same way that Alcatraz is surrounded by San Francisco Bay. That wilderness is, figuratively speaking, the outer wall. The actual outer wall evolved over the years. I like this stone version. It was built from 1884 to 87. It's 40 feet high, stone, from stones cut out of Lion Mountain. It took forever. The budget to build it was never adequate, and the project repeatedly shut down when it ran out of money. The Clinton Correctional Facility, formerly Clinton Prison, because it's in Clinton County, New York. It's a maximum security state prison and one of the oldest, built in 1844 as an outpost region. The location was considered prime because it was in a valley, close to iron mines and near the hills of Lion Mountain, which is not just a mountain, but the area around the mountain. The first inmates lived in shacks heated by wood in the winter and were chained together and forced to build the prison. Now, like Cooperstown and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Dannemora, New York, the village, is a one-company town. Accommodations cater to visitors in town to see inmates. And a large percentage of the village people work inside the prison. One unintentional symptom of this arrangement was that prison inmates and employees, all working together in what is, by any definition, a horrible place, they tended to forget their adversarial role. There was a sense of, we're all in this together, let's make it nice. Now, one of the things I learned during my research for my book was how hard it had been to get these creeps behind bars in the first place. So much hard work and sacrifice, including the ultimate sacrifice, was involved. Let's start with Sweat. He was a juvenile delinquent from the Binghamton area, Binghamton, New York. He was rapidly growing into big boy crimes. He and his pals had a fort deep in the woods where they kept their four-wheel drive vehicles that they'd stolen. They had a wacky notion of starting an army like Rat Patrol or something. And on July 4th, 2002, the gang pulled off a heist in Pennsylvania, stealing a carload of arms and ammo. But at 4 in the morning, while back home in a schoolyard, transferring the stuff from one vehicle to another, they were discovered by this man, Broome County Sheriff's Deputy Kevin J. Tarzia. A gunfight ensued. With the cop down, Sweat drove his car over Tarzia's body a few times to make sure he was dead. The gang that did it was picked up within hours, and Sweat's days of freedom were through. Sweat, however, wasn't just a juvenile delinquent who hit the criminal big time. He also had an unusual set of skills. He could think in 3 dimensions and read a blueprint upside down. Now, a few years earlier, during the 1990s, this man, Richard Matt, was a one-man crime wave in Buffalo, New York. He had a rap sheet as long as your arm and had on one occasion escaped from a Buffalo jail. While on the loose, his crimes escalated until he was arrested for kidnapping, torturing, killing, and dismembering a former boss in an attempted robbery that went really, really, really bad. It was December 3rd, 1997. Matt's partner that night was 25-year-old Lee Eugene Bates, a part-time strip club employee and criminal justice major at Erie Community College. Bates would later deal with the prosecution and testify against Matt. Convinced that his ex-boss, William Rickerson, had cash hidden away in his home, Matt tortured him by breaking his fingers to tell him where the money was. Matt eventually tired of the game and murdered his ex-boss by snapping his neck. He then chopped up the body with a saw and threw the pieces into the Niagara River. A lot happened after Rickerson's murder. Matt fled to Mexico. He was arrested down there for killing a guy in a bar men's room. He tried to escape a few times and was reportedly tortured in a Mexican prison. He made himself a pain in the jailers' butts, so they agreed to send him back to New York State for prosecution. Matt was prosecuted expertly by Lou Haremsky, one of the real good guys in this story. Could be a better picture, but you can tell he's a good guy. He made sure the jury got it. Matt was a man with no conscience. He was an evil man. He needed to be locked up, the key thrown away. Well, Matt was locked up all right, but as we'll see, they forgot to throw away the key. Matt was sent to Dannemora, where he brought with him another special set of skills. He appealed to women and was a charming schmoozer with men as well, a manipulator, a man who could recruit anyone to help his cause. Now, for reasons that boggle the mind, the folks at Clinton Correctional thought it was an okay idea to put David Sweat and Richard Matt in adjacent cells. The men they'd been behaving themselves, and they were an honor block, where there were increased freedoms. Honor block privileges were doled out for recent behavior without any consideration to what the men had done to be there in the first place. The move put Sweat's three-dimensional thinking next to Matt and his charisma, and boom, perfect storm. The storm in which the seemingly impossible escape was created. The men could confer all day in voices so soft no one else could hear. The situation was a perfect storm in another way as well. On one side, you had the two-headed monster, Matt and Sweat, scheming to get out, and on the other side, the time-honored arrogance and complacency of the prison personnel, the pervasive thinking that escape was impossible, so why bother with compliance to the rules? The first thing Sweat and Matt did was learn what was on the other side of their cell wall. To do this, they talked a guard into giving them a tour. There was space between the cell wall and the prison wall, and between the rear of the cells in honor block and the outer wall of the building was surprisingly roomy, great catwalks. All the men would have to do was cut a hole in their cell wall, which was thin, and they could crawl into that space alone in the infrastructure of the building. Oh, go back, Sam. This is the hole that Sweat cut in the back of his cell. He crawled out of this hole 85 times, but crawled back for only 84 of them. With only primitive tools with which to work, Sweat drilled, sawed, and chipped out an escape route to freedom. The grates on the other side of Sweat and Matt's back wall enabled one to see the catwalks above and below. Sweat said that he once had to hide from a corrections officer who'd walked out on a catwalk above him and had to dodge when the guard dropped a lit cigarette butt. A major obstacle was the steam pipe the men would need to crawl through to get outside the prison wall. During much of the year, it was too hot to even approach. So it had to be June, before the summer heat, but after the heat was turned off in the building. It involved a lot of work, all of which was done by Sweat. Using tools that had been left around by prison maintenance workers, they built an entrance hole in the prison steam pipe, and then on their way out, the prisoners left a post-it next to the hole. It had on it a racially offensive drawing and the words, "Have a nice day." Ah, prison humor. Less than a half hour after leaving their cells, the inmates emerged into freedom from this manhole, a block south of the prison wall, right smack dab in the middle of the village of Dannemora. And this was when their plan fell apart. But we'll get to that. Without the expected getaway car, the men were forced to proceed on foot. Their possessions in a guitar case, they took on the wilderness that was Clinton Correctional's outer wall. And what followed was the largest manhunt in New York State history. At one point, 1,200 members of law enforcement were actively searching for the escapees. The search continued despite seemingly relentless inclement weather. The hunters figured if it was miserable for them, it was twice as miserable for Matt and Sweat, and that gave them the energy to forge on. Now, if either Matt and Sweat had been a survivalist, a Bear Grylls type, they might have avoided capture. They might have just gone deep into the wilderness and never been seen again. But they weren't, and they needed to stay close to civilization, and that gave their hunters a chance. 23 days into the manhunt, stalwart members of law enforcement, exhausted from long hours and waterlogged from relentless rain, continued to beat the bushes in search of the missing desperados. When weather permitted, state police helicopter surveillance was used. Every structure within miles was searched, and it was evidence found in a cabin that led to the tightening of the circle around the escapees. Now, perhaps the one innocent civilian most inconvenienced by the escape was 31-year-old Joshua Lamity. He was born and raised in Malone, New York, and during the spring and summer of 2015, he was working 2 jobs to support his kids. He was repeatedly apprehended during the manhunt by cops who thought he was David Sweat. Here he is. There's a strong facial resemblance, but Lamity was much shorter. Eventually, Lamity had police give him a note explaining to the next eager cop that he wasn't Sweat. Now, one of the first people to talk to reporters was Richard Matt's son, who seemed eager to portray his dad as some sort of Superman who could escape from any prison, who could take a licking and keep on ticking. During one prison escape, the son said, Matt made it up to the roof of the prison and got shot in the shoulder. The son knew it was true, too, because his dad had pulled down his shirt and showed the bullet wound. The guy had bullet holes in his body. The son concluded he's been shot like 9 times. It's like they can't kill him. In the days after the escape, New York State Governor Cuomo took several tours of CCF. Here he is with his big governor feet stomping on a crime scene before the crime scene investigators had finished with it. Now, many experts blame the escape on the governor's own budget cuts, but his Inspector General's report, which came out a year later, put the emphasis on pervasive slacking among CCF employees. Here we get to the good part. There she is. The femme fatale of the story, Joyce Mitchell. A plain woman with a mutton head, bored and caught up in her own fantasy world. A condition that Sweat and Matt exploited expertly. She believed in inmates with benefits. She taught the sewing class at Clinton and had taught both Sweat and Matt, who each had sweet-talked her into sexual favors. We won't get into the gruesome details of prison sex, but they're in my book. Joyce was a married woman with a son, and she was convinced, mostly by Richard Matt, that she was his girlfriend, that she was going to help he and Sweat escape, and she was going to give them the blades they needed to cut back doors in their cells. She was going to supply the getaway car when they emerged on the outside from the manhole at Buck Street. Then the three of them were going to ride off into the sunset. Joyce Mitchell, some noticed, was starting to wear more eye makeup when she went to work. It took her a long time, but she, at the last second, figured out that the prisoners were deceiving her. She wasn't really Matt's girlfriend, and he was going to kill her and leave her by the side of the road the instant they had her car. She had a panic attack and was in the hospital having her heart monitored when she was supposed to be picking up the escapees. She ended up being charged with promoting prison contraband and criminal facilitation. Her story changed over time. Her first explanations included her loneliness, her sexual neediness, her willingness to bump off her husband. But after a lawyer briefed her, no doubt repeatedly, she told a different tale, one of being victimized, of sexual degradation and extortion. Boo-hoo. Now, the only prison guard to face charges in connection with the escape was Gene Palmer, who smuggled frozen hamburger meat into Matt, not knowing that Joyce Mitchell had hidden a hacksaw blade inside it. So, in return for the favors received, Richard Matt gave Palmer paintings. Both prisoners were talented artists, which made them interesting to the folks on the outside and gave them something they could produce and trade for favors. Now, Palmer pleaded guilty to the charges against him and was sentenced to 6 months in prison, $5,375 in fines and court surcharges. Palmer also agreed to resign from his job, but I don't think he should be lumped in with Mitchell. He had no idea that anything he was doing would facilitate an escape. He thought he was giving them hamburgers so they could have a decent meal. She, of course, was a co-conspirator. Clinton County District Attorney Andrew Wiley kept the public abreast of developments during the manhunt and successfully prosecuted Mitchell and Sweat after the manhunt, and took the time to help a writer out with some details when he was trying to write a book really fast. Now, warning to everybody, before I put on the next slide, it's gross. So if you don't want to see, look away, and I will tell you when you can look back. The manhunt for the escapees was approaching the end of 3 weeks when, unbeknownst to police, Sweat had abandoned Matt, who was slower and drunker than his partner. Alone, Matt turned out to be an easy target. On June 26th, Texas Border Patrol agent Christopher Voss shot Matt 3 times with his M4 rifle, killing him, a nice grouping, right in the head. Okay, to look back. Now, during autopsy, blisters were found on Matt's feet and multiple bug bites throughout his body. It was confirmed that Matt had been eating and drinking while on the run. His blood alcohol level was 0.18, more than twice the drunk drive limit. Now, at 3:20 p.m. on June 28th, a Sunday, Sergeant J. Hook was all alone and patrolling an area on Coveytown Road near the town of Constable, about a mile and a half south of the Canadian border. Cook was driving his vehicle when he spotted a man in a camouflage outfit. Cook stopped the car and watched as the man in fatigues walked into a newly cut alfalfa field. Cook stopped the vehicle and pursued on foot. He had a strong visual on the subject and recognized the man as Sweat. Luckily, it wasn't Lamity. Now, when Sweat realized that he'd been recognized, he made a run for it, heading for a line of trees. The officer knew that if the prisoner made it to the trees, he would likely evade capture and quickly cross the border into Canada. "Stop or I'll shoot," Cook called out. Sweat did not stop, but Cook did. A marksman, Cook stopped to take aim, took a deep breath, and squeezed off the first shot. The bullet struck Sweat but did not bring him down. Cook fired again striking his mark, and this time Sweat fell to the ground. Sweat was wounded but survived to give us his version of events. He was prosecuted for his escape and placed in permanent solitary confinement. He may have been able to burrow his way out once, but in the long run, justice prevailed, and Sweat now finds himself deeper than ever inside the belly of the beast. And just as in any perfect story, the good guys won in the end. In June 2016, just past the 1-year anniversary of the escape, the Inspector General's report was released, blaming the escape on long-standing systemic failures in management and oversight. The culture was such that, when asked about sticking to regulations, many Clinton employees admitted they didn't know what the regulations were. At one time, inspections of the prison's tunnel infrastructure had been frequent, but not since 1995. Weekly inspections of cell integrity, one of which would have busted Matt and Sweat, had been discontinued so long ago that there were corrections officers who didn't know they ever existed. There were an estimated 400 required checks of Sweat's cell that would have caught him sneaking out the back door, but didn't. The report revealed that Joyce Mitchell smuggled more than 70 containers of pepper into the prison and gave them to Matt. They were supposed to be used to hide the scent of the men as they moved through the woods so bloodhounds couldn't follow them. One of the key items the prisoners acquired while planning their escape was a tape measure. Using it, Sweat could measure the openings he was cutting, and Matt could measure his girth so they could be sure Matt wouldn't get stuck somewhere along the line. Mitchell supplied it, but putting it in a drawer in the tailor shop where Matt picked it up. The long orange extension cord that Sweat used to provide himself with an electric fan and light during his work had been left behind at the site where contractors recently installed a new boiler. In addition to tools, the box held rechargeable battery packs and disposable breathing masks. Now, maps are prohibited in prison, but Mitchell smuggled a whole atlas into her trailer shop so Matt could familiarize himself with the roads leading away from Dannemora. Unfortunately for them, the men accidentally left the map behind on escape night. The report thoroughly itemized the proper procedures at CCF, supporting their central thesis that new regulations do not need to be put in place as much as old regulations needed to be followed. The culture of carelessness at Clinton Correctional Facility needed to stop. The Inspector General's conclusions were in a nutshell: 1, train staff better; 2, increase camera surveillance; 3, stringently follow regulations already in place; 4, inspect the catwalk and tunnel system more than once a year, hopefully monthly; 5, supply oversight of the Department of Corrections to ensure the integrity of the system; 6, use canines to detect contraband; 7, keep a closer eye on tools left behind by contractors and maintenance people; 8, better oversee tailor shops; 9, revamp the honor system; and 10, more severely discipline and effectively counsel officers and civilian employees who break the rules. Now, on a personal note, I'm always touched with sadness when I talk about this book. It was written during the last months, weeks, and days of my mother's life, and I can't help but recall interviewing Sweat's relatives and Buffalo detectives who had arrested Matt on the phone from the living room of the hospice. Now, talking about Matt and Sweat got me on 2020 on ABC, interviewed for 8 grueling hours in the green room for The View. I got to use the same restroom as Whoopi Goldberg. And there have been a couple of TV movies, one a rather odd romance in which the story was adapted for a Hallmark Lifetime type audience. And of course, the miniseries directed by Ben Stiller, which we'll be hearing more about from our next speaker, Ms. Ivy Gocker, who saw some of the making of that picture up close. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope everyone who wants my book can find it. Hopefully, it's at a locally owned bookstore near you. If not, you can always get it online. Thank you for listening, and back to you, Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was wonderful. And we will be posting a link to the book. You can get it at the ADKX store, as well as through your local libraries. So I'm very pleased to introduce Ivy Gocker, who Michael just mentioned. Ivy has a special place in all of us at ADKX in our heart. She was the former library director, but what she's most noteworthy for this evening is the fact that she had a cameo opportunity in the Showtime miniseries. And so we thought it more than appropriate for her to have a cameo opportunity in this evening's program. Ivy is now the director of the Woodstock Public Library. Ivy.
Thank you, Cheryl. And Michael, you're a very tough act to follow, I'm going to say. But I'm glad that everybody got the very important and relevant information tonight up first, because I'm sort of the frothy part of tonight's presentation, I think. But yes, I can talk a little bit about my experience as an extra on the set of the Ben Stiller Showtime series, Escape at Dannemora. Different from your book, correct? That was Escape from Dannemora. So there's an important.
Yeah, they completely changed it.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but so yes, that was I was living in the Adirondacks. I had moved there in 2016 to take the job at the museum as the library director. So I wasn't living in the Adirondacks when the actual escape happened, but I did happen to be vacationing there that summer. So I had, very strong memories of the manhunt and all of the tension and excitement around that. But so when the summer of 2017 came around and there was news that they were going to be making a mini series, I think a lot of people who lived up there were, very intrigued at how this was going to be pulled off and, how the story was going to be told. And at the time, I was actually on maternity leave from my job at the museum because I had a baby in May of 2017. So I found myself with a newborn infant. I wasn't working. I had a lot of time on my hands, which made me the perfect candidate to be an extra in the TV series. So there was an open casting call that was announced, in the local media in Plattsburgh in July of 2017. And so my husband and I went to that kind of just to see what it was going to be like, to see, we had never had any experience with showbiz before, but we thought, let's give it a shot, see what's happening. So we went to Plattsburgh, we took headshots of each other, and had them printed out at the local drugstore so that we were ready for our big audition. But of course, when we got there were hundreds of people turning in their paperwork, looking to have some kind of role in this series. So we submitted all of the information. I think we spoke to a couple casting agents. I actually got interviewed by, I think it was the Adirondack Daily Enterprise. They were just talking to people who were waiting in line. And so I happened to get a quote in the newspaper saying how excited I was that they were going to be doing this Showtime series. And then we kind of forgot about it for 2 months because we thought, nothing's going to come of this. But then in September, we started getting text messages from the casting company. And, the messages weren't like, hey, we really loved your style. We really want you to feature you in this show. The messages were more like, do you have nothing else to do on the evening of, September 17th? Like, are you willing to come and pretend to be a nurse for 6 hours? So, it quickly became clear that we weren't exactly talent. We were just sort of more bodies to provide some background. But as it happened, I was available the night that they asked me to come up, and I had nothing else to do, which is the biggest requirement to be an extra. So I drove up to Malone one evening and spent, I think, probably 4 hours just waiting with the other extras um, at the Moose Lodge. And while the real filming was happening somewhere else, but all of us extras were sort of there on call for when they needed us. So they put me in a nurse's uniform and I sat around. Luckily, I'd brought a book with me. I talked to the other people who were there as extras. And one thing that was interesting was that a lot of the other extras on set that night weren't going to appear on screen themselves. They were extras because they were going to be driving their cars um, in the show, and they needed cars that would have been typical um, for that summer. So it was people with very specific makes and models of cars that looked appropriate, for the setting. But that was most of the other extras who were there that night. They did give us some free food, which was nice. And then after several hours of waiting around, they drove us all to the Alice Hyde Medical Center in Malone and got us all set up for our shot. So I was like, okay, here's my big moment. I'm very excited. But really what they asked me to do was just walk through the doors of the hospital in my nurse's uniform, out onto the street, and then go lean against a pillar and pretend to drink a cup of coffee. So they provided me with the nurse's uniform and with the empty cup of coffee. And I'll tell you, like, it seems like a natural enough thing to drink a cup of coffee, but if you're doing it on camera, suddenly it feels very strange. And the whole time I was like, oh, am I doing this right? If I do this, yes, yeah, see? You're a natural.
Oh,
We should put you on camera. But so yeah, I did that for probably half an hour over and over and over again. For the assembled crew, which of course didn't include Ben Stiller. This was like the second or third string camera crew. So Ben Stiller was probably enjoying his dinner somewhere else while they were filming this B-roll footage. Um, and that was pretty much the extent of it. We shot that a bunch of times. Then they took us to another location in case they were going to need us, but they ended up not. So altogether, it probably took up about 7 hours of my life. Um, and then in the end, when the show came out, I was so excited to watch the whole series. I think it was maybe 9 hours long. I watched all of it obsessively, waiting for my moment, but I'm pretty sure that my scene got cut. So, in the end, I think they paid me about $125. Um, and I have this, fascinating story to tell now to everyone who's listening tonight. So yeah, I will turn it back over for questions. I'm sure people have a lot of questions to ask me. So I'm sorry, Michael, if if they don't have any for you.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Okay, the scene you were going to be in, was that where Joyce Mitchell goes to the hospital when she's having her panic attack?
I assume so, or I'm guessing it was. The other thing I thought could have been if they shot a scene at the hospital after one of the prisoners was shot, but it was a nighttime scene, so I think you're probably right. It's because
Yeah, it was
Joyce was at dinner and then she had her panic
right. She
attack.
and
Is that right?
Lyle go to the hospital
Yes,
and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So I guess it would have been the establishing shot for that moment, but I'm pretty sure it's not in the
Anyway, I'm
show.
so sorry. Show business is such an ugly,
Yeah.
ugly thing.
Yeah. After that, I quit it forever.
There you
I
go.
said, I've had it.
You're too good for show business.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ivy and Michael, so much. We have some questions from the audience. So one question from Anthony was there initial plan after escaping to head to Canada, or did they have plans to head back to their hometowns or a big city?
I think it was Mexico, uh, because Richard Matt had experience with Mexico. He'd been there. Um, didn't have a very good time there, but I think he felt he knew the geography a little bit, and he knew that once he got across the border, that the odds were good that if he didn't want to go back, he wouldn't have to.
The other question was, did the woman receive a jail or prison sentence?
Oh yeah, she went away for a couple of years, I think, maybe more. I would have said two years in a movie, in a training film for future prison employees might have been a good punishment for her. I think she might have done it more than a couple of years though, because such a high profile case. The other thing is, I always wondered why the assumption was that if they crossed the Canadian border, they were home free. Now, Canada has police. I know it's I think that a lot of law enforcement think very much in terms of victory and losses, and for us to bust the guy is a victory. To let him go to the next area, if somebody else busts him, that's a loss. Anyway,
Yeah. Another question from Anthony is, with these failures in the correction system, has there been any call to privatize the correction system in New York?
I haven't heard any. Um, I don't see where. I don't think that the public funding for the prison system has anything to do with the problems that existed. It really is. It's almost a matter of building a prison that's too good,
Mhm.
because if you go more than a generation without an escape, you don't have anybody in that building that knows how to do it or what to do if it happens, how to stop it. There's a lot of ignorance going on. Like a lot of people didn't even know what the rules were, and they'd worked there for 10 years because this is how you do your daily job. They used to do it a more complicated way, but we don't do it that way anymore.
James asked, what happened to make Joyce wake up and realize she was being used?
Good question. That's a question for her and her alone, I would think. Uh, it may just have been because she's eating Chinese food with her husband when the light bulb goes on. And maybe she just saw love in his eyes and realized it was something she'd never seen from the prisoners, or maybe love's even too strong of a word. She saw kindness in Lyle, and she knew that the two guys that she was going to go with were desperate criminals. Uh, why it took so long for the light to go on, I do not know. Uh, and maybe it's like a lot of fantasies. Fantasies seem really appealing and titillating right up until the moment when they start to become real and you realize that it's a fantasy. Yeah, I heard that from a friend. Um, but I think that's true. I think that we do suddenly we get a blast of reality if we try to make our fantasies real. And she was in the process of doing that. And yeah, the light bulb went on.
Another question, did Sweat and Matt generally rely on breaking into summer homes and camps for shelter, food, liquor, etc.? Were they ever able to obtain any weapons from these places during their days of escape?
Yes, yes, and yes. They relied on the hunting shacks that were in the woods. They were usually unoccupied if it wasn't hunting season. There was usually a gun in there. And I know they found a bag of pot and the bottle of liquor, and Matt tried to keep himself as inebriated as possible, just because he was not a man used to discomfort. And here he is covered with bug bites and blisters, and he's a heavy guy. He's not moving, and he's got a much better conditioned partner who's constantly yelling at him, "Come on, hurry up!" And eventually they split up because they were not equal at escaping. And it was rather predictable after that that Matt lost his life. He must have known that he was toast at that point. Standing in the woods covered in bug bites. Just, I'm surprised he might have been, thinking about, yeah, shoot me, please.
Sally asks, how long did it take for the prisoners to plan the escape?
Well, again, that's hard to say. I would say that they actively planned the escape for about 6 months. I'm sure it was cooking in at least Sweat's brain before that. He had an idea of how the prison, like I said, he could read a blueprint upside down. He had an idea of where he was compared to everything else in a three-dimensional way. All he needed to know was what was behind his wall, and he could tell by tapping on it that it's a thin piece of tin. That's you look at those back doors they cut. They just, all you need was a little saw. You give me a little saw, I don't think I could get out of this room. There's bricks involved and stuff. Anyway,
Mhm.
they didn't build the cells themselves to be secure. And again, it's just this feeling that, okay, if they get out, the woods is going to get them anyway.
Jean asks, can you tell us more how the wounded prisoner made it to Albany Medical Center? So I think
No,
that's David Sweat wound up
I
here in
don't,
Albany.
I
I think
don't
we're
know
the
how.
closest trauma center, honestly.
Yeah, I would think that would have been a medical decision, and
Mhm,
maybe also a security decision. At
mhm,
that point, you've got a complete mob scene of press,
mhm.
curiosity seekers, uh, law enforcement who want to be in on the action. I think you need to go to a place where you can secure a hospital room and maybe even have a place where you could have a press conference, that kind of thing. Or else he just had a wound that would have been better treated there. Um, One or the other, maybe both.
Nancy asked, as a regular prisoner visitor, what impact did the escape have on all other institutions, inmates, and visitors who had been behaving appropriately all along?
It shouldn't have been too much. I would think not that bad.
Mhm.
If you are behaving yourself all along and you're okay with being patted down before and after a visit, I don't see any reason why their lives should have been made more complicated. It's people who want to sneak out of their cell and put a dummy in its place that are, all of a sudden you've got guards with heat-seeking, or what do you call them, heat glasses on, so you can tell a dummy from a real person, which is, really ingenious way to figure out if somebody's trying to fool you.
Someone asked, I think it's Joyce, right? Is Joyce out of prison? And did she stay in the area?
Again, I don't know for sure. I know that she initially went back to her husband. They have a son who was freaked out by all of this and probably wants to be anonymous and separate from it. So I mean, that family has problems.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, let me read something quick. This is the closing paragraph of my book, and it gives a psychological perspective on all of this. Let's see. Okay. You're not sick of listening to me read already. In the long run, it became clear that the story of the escaping prisoners was so popular because we could so easily identify with the escapees. Along with our fear that while Matt and Sweat were out, innocent people would be victimized, there was an undeniable sense of envy. We are all prisoners, men and women who have, like Joyce Mitchell, long before she was locked up, forged our own chains and bars and perpetually seek release. I don't think that letting her out of prison frees her up at all. She was in prison before she was arrested. She's in prison now, and it's all from the neck up. And I wish the best for her, but I have doubts that that family's been able to stick together for all this time. If anybody knows different, let me know, because I'm rooting for them. But that's a lot to. Oh, did they sit down and watch the movie together? That's got to be tough, right?
Yeah. David asked, did one of them drink water from a stream that gave him dysentery, making it
Well,
easier for the dogs to track him?
that sounds like somebody who knows the answer already. Um, Very specific question. Yeah, well, I don't know if it was drinking water from a stream that did it, but yeah, apparently Matt had the runs and may have helped the bloodhounds chase him.
Um,
Looking
Another
for
question.
a change of underwear in the middle of
Oh, no.
nowhere. Hard.
Darren asked Michael, with the interviews you did you get a chance to speak with Lyle Mitchell at all?
No, no, and purposefully, I left the Mitchells alone. And
Mhm.
maybe this is, not the best journalistic technique, but sometimes I go into a situation and I just feel so sorry for people that I just so, I mean,
Yeah.
Lyle's not the story.
Mhm.
I guess that there's been an implication that he's less than an exciting man, or I know that in was it Lifetime or Hallmark, whatever the first movie, there's a scene where Joyce's eyes glaze over because he's going on and on and on about his daily life, which is she finds intensely boring. But that's not a crime, and he does not deserve any of the notoriety that he's received, or the fame, or the infame, or whatever it is. Um, so I left them. I would have interviewed Joyce in a minute if I'd have gotten. She only wanted to talk to Matt Lauer, which shows what a keen instinct she has for men. Um, anyway, I don't know if you remember Matt Lauer went down in shame.
Ellen asked, curious what other books you've written. Are they true crime based? What drew you to this story?
Okay. Yeah, I started out, I spent 20 years being a mediocre sports writer. We won't talk about it. But I became a true crime writer in the aughts, the 20 aughts, because when I was a kid, I was 9 years old. My babysitter and a friend of hers were murdered in a backfield behind my house. Boogeyman crossed my backfield for real when I was 9 years old. And as an adult, I trained myself to become a true crime writer to do a murder investigation, and then went back to my hometown, hooked up with a mom of one of the victims who was still alive. She was 90, and a private detective. And we, as they say, sent the investigation in a startling new direction. After that, I continued as a true crime writer. I have written a book about the Grateful Dead, which is Pride and Joy. Um, and this story is published by the same publisher who did the Grateful Dead book. I'd sort of hoped that I would get another music-oriented book, but the phone call came and said, how'd you like to cover the prison escape? It was University Press of New England. So it was a local story for them. That's the academic press for Dartmouth and Brandeis. No longer exists. They went out of business. The book's been orphaned to a certain extent. Um, and said, you want to do this? And I said, well, sure, absolutely. Um, and to be perfectly honest, only remember maybe 10 or 20% of it because it was all about, my mom at that time in my life. I'm sorry.
Debbie asked, did you meet either Joyce or David or any of their family? I think you might have answered that a little bit.
David's family. Yes. David's family was very talkative.
Mm.
They wanted to say, he was a good kid. He went bad. We remember when he was nice. Um, don't spell our name wrong. So, but none of Joyce's family. And with Richard Matt, I spoke to some members of his family and a lot of cops who knew him from when he was a kid, cops who arrested him for the murder of Rickerson, which is still one of the worst single murders I've ever encountered. I mean, I talked about the breaking of the fingers briefly, but they had him locked in the trunk of a car, and they would drive and drive and drive and drive, and then stop the car and open the trunk, break another finger, say, tell us where the money is. I don't have any money. They'd slam the trunk, get in the car, drive and drive and drive and drive. And it went on all night like that. And they got from Buffalo to Erie, Pennsylvania, and almost back again before he killed him. So, I mean, the police I talked to were angry. They were so angry at the correction system. How could you let this guy out? Don't you know how much work it was to get this guy in? So I also found that at the time, that was an angle that wasn't being covered in the press a lot. It was just assumed that they were, you know, they were prisoners and they escaped. How they got to be prisoners was part of the story, I found.
Yeah. Greg asked, I'd heard that the escapees knew where some of the guards' hunting camps were from discussions with guards.
I have not heard that. I didn't even know that some of the campsites they visited did belong to camp guards or prison guards. Not sure if that's true or not, can't confirm.
Someone asked, how could the guards possibly not notice Sweat missing from his cell while working on the tunnel?
He put a dummy in his cot.
They didn't check.
And they didn't check. Nobody checked. In fact, they didn't even make rounds. I mean, there was, you know, let the new guy make the rounds. We're having a card game in the back room. He made a racket too. A lot of what he did made a lot of noise. And apparently it was just, you know, the infrastructure of the old building tended to make noise in the middle of the night. But you know, pound, 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 pound. You know, it's amazing that somebody didn't go, what's that digging sound in the wall? You know, it's like reminds me of Hogan's Heroes. And, you know, how could you not know?
We've got a question for Ivy.
Oh,
Ivy, did
yay.
you Ivy, did you get a sense that Ben Stiller really wanted to tell the correct story or an embellished version?
Well, I didn't actually get to have any conversations with Ben about it, honestly, but I do think, you know, I mean, of course it's sensationalized because it's a TV movie, but you know, when I was following this story, you heard so much about this like charisma that Richard Matt had, apparently. And you know, all we ever saw was like the mugshot. And looking at the mugshot, I'm like, this does not translate. I do not see how are people being convinced of anything by this guy. But then casting Benicio del Toro to play him, like, okay, I get it now. Like, so I think there's something, you know, even if it's sensational, just seeing an actor play out the story, it does help it make sense a little bit because you're like, okay, yeah, these are people sharing space and you know, they're interacting. So it's somewhat instructive, even if it's also very Hollywood and exaggerated.
Thank you. Caroline asked, how did the manhunt for Matt and Sweat compare to the manhunt for Robert Garrow? Does that name?
I don't know. It's still the biggest in New York State. The second biggest, I think, is Bucky Phillips. If Garrow's not in New York State, I don't know.
I think Garrow was another Adirondack.
Oh, from like the old days.
From old, yeah, an older
Okay.
one.
Oh, this was much bigger. I suspect they had, you know, 7 guys with shotguns and a dog for the first one. This is the 2015 escape. Pretty much every law enforcement personnel in the state was there. I mean, the volunteers were. You could rob a bank in Olean without any problem because they're out looking for Matt and Sweat.
We're going to do one more question. Anthony asks, what efforts have been made by New York State Corrections to change the dysfunctional culture that existed at Dannemora? Also, is it probable that the same culture exists in other facilities?
I'm guessing that getting out of Clinton right now is impossible. But I'll bet you that there are New York State correctional facilities that changed not one bit because of this. don't look at us. Until they have an escape, there won't be any changes made. It's always, you don't want to know what happened the day before they invented the catcher's mask. It's you don't want to know the day they decided the Indy 500 shouldn't run on gasoline; it should run on alcohol instead, because gasoline explodes. These lessons are always learned the hard way, and that would be my guess. Although I'm not an expert in the New York State correctional system, I would think that Clinton, with the spotlight on them, they snap too. But elsewhere, maybe not so much. I don't know.
Thank you so much, Michael, Ivy, for tonight's program. And Megan, thank you for guiding us through this conversation. The comments, the chats, the questions have been fantastic. One thing I did want to make note of, a few people actually commented that Joyce Mitchell is still with her husband living in Franklin County, and you can see her at Walmart. So so keep an eye out. So thank you again.
Does she sign autographs?
Thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. This series is going to take a hiatus. We'll be back with you in April. We've got 2 programs that we're going to wrap up the series with. We've got a program on April 9th with Gem Radio Theater. They're going to be doing a short production featuring stories told in the voice of the criminals themselves. And then we will be wrapping up our True Crime of the Adirondack series, bringing in New York Times bestselling author and award winner Jennifer Donnelly, whose novel A Northern Light retells the infamous true story of the murder of Grace Brown. And there is a link to registration information and details on those programs in the chat. So thank you very much. We kind of had a little bit of fun talking about the fact that there was a romance to this evening's presentation. And so we wish all of you who are, in the mood for some exciting love that, that this program has inspired you. And thank you, Michael, again. Thank you, Ivy. And we hope to see you at our next Zoom program. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.